You're listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NACS. We'll talk about what we see at stores and what the future may hold for our industry.
This episode marks the 62nd anniversary at NACS. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about where NACS came from, how it came to be, where it's going, and a few interesting stories along the way. So today on Convenience Matters, no guest, just going to tell some stories, looking at 62 years, actually close to 100 years of the Convenience Store Association. It's ultimately, convenience store industry. Ultimately, this is a look ahead. As President Harry Truman said about history, there's nothing new in the world except the history you don't know. So let's look a little bit about some of the history. It'll inform us about where we're going in the future. So I had mentioned NACS was founded August 14th, 1961, 62 years ago on the date of this publication. But I want to go back a little further and look at the first convenience store and how that came to be. And that first convenience store happened in May 1927 in Dallas, Texas. There was Southland Ice Corporation in Dallas. And back then, for those not familiar, ice was bought in giant blocks and it was put in an ice box because there really weren't refrigerators at the time. So if you had things that were perishable, you had an ice box and you bought big blocks of ice. And those ice companies were typically open later in the day after grocery stores closed at 5 o'clock. Picked it up on the way home, so 6, 7, 8, whatever their closing time was. It was later than every other store. And this Southland Ice Dock in Dallas decided, hey, I'm going to start selling some other items, milk, bread, eggs, things that people need that are convenience items, along with the ice. Of course, you're not going to put them in a bag and you're not going to put the eggs on the bottom and ice on top. Of course, ways to do that. But that's how our industry became what it was. And that Southland Ice Company eventually became, they started stores that were called totem stores. You tote items. Ultimately, their hours changed to 7 in the morning till 11 at night. And Southland Corporation, 7-Eleven got its name. We'll go down that path and talk a little bit more about 24-hour stores a little bit later. But if you look at 1927, a couple events set up that first convenience store. First off, the merging of gas stations and convenience stores. The first gas station was 1913, 14 years before the first convenience store. Now, it took almost 40 years for the first official gas station, which by all accounts, or most accounts, was opened. It was a purpose-built one, which means it was a deliberate one as opposed to these shacks that existed for years, just to pour liquid. And this was a gas station that was designed as a gas station in Pittsburgh. So that was 40 years after the first car, 1885. So it took a little while for that industry to get going. Of course, a year after the first gas station, what do you have? You have the first car wash. But the event that really led to the convenience store industry happened a few years after that. And that was the first modern grocery store. It was a Piggly Wiggly in Memphis. And this first Piggly Wiggly changed the concept of retail. Prior to 1919, when you went to a grocery store, you handed a clerk a shopping list. And that shopping list the clerk took, walked away for a bit, got all your items, handed you a sack of those items. Here's your bill, and off you go. It was one customer at a time per clerk, and it was pretty inefficient. And then you had in 1919, Piggly Wiggly decided that we are going to create a store where everybody gets their items and checks out. And you don't have to have one clerk, one order, multiple people can shop at the same time. It transformed everything. It really opened up the whole concept of convenience and ultimately led to that first convenience store just a few years later. So Over the next 30 years, the convenience store industry grew slowly. Mentioned Totem became 7-Eleven. But most of these stores were located in warm weather areas because essentially they were mini mart was a term that was used, and it was used because they looked like little grocery stores, and they had roll up doors just like a auto repair shop would have, and limited HVAC. So you can't really be in an area that's super cold. You were in areas where, yes, it got hot, but still able to shop in colder weather because it wasn't ridiculously freezing inside the store. So you tended to see stores in Texas and nearby states where the weather was warmer year round. Couple stores opened in Colorado, and it's arguably the first cold weather store opened in the mid-50s in Colorado by this gentleman by the name of John Roscoe. And we'll be talking a little bit more about him as we go through the story of our industry. But he was known for a whole bunch of innovations. And as I said, first and foremost, the first cold weather store and transforming a couple other elements. The interstate highway system that happened in the late 50s also transformed how Americans shopped and really led to the massive growth of convenience stores. It created the suburbs, and convenience stores were located closer to consumers than the grocery stores that tended to be more in city centers. The convenience stores also were located where highways were. So you had highway stores, you had suburban stores, and that really led to the acceleration of the industry. And it really set the stage for why we needed an association to share ideas, to network, and ultimately to advocate on behalf of the industry. And that gets to the creation of NACS in 1961. John Roscoe, who I mentioned earlier, was one of the 13 founders that was there for the founding of NACS. And this was at a hotel called the Muleback in Kansas City. So the Muleback Hotel is where we had a dozen retailers get together and talk about how to create an association. What was going on in August 1961? Well, the day before these retailers met, the Berlin Wall went up. It was barbed wire at the time. Ultimately, they constructed that more. But that was the beginning of the Cold War. And the number one song on the radio at the time, Tossing and Turning, by, I guess it was Bobby Lewis. And if you hear the song, that means we have budget. If you don't hear the song, that means we don't have budget. And the answer is we don't have budget. But the first line was almost prophetic of that song. I couldn't sleep at all last night. And if you think about what convenience stores ultimately created, it was that 24-hour scene. Now, there weren't 24-hour convenience stores when NACS was founded. That happened a year later. And there are two rumors to that one, both related to, or two explanations where the first one was. And that they're both related to 7-Elevens. One, in 1962, they had a store in Austin, Texas. It was near the University of Texas. And it was very busy after a football game. So busy, in fact, that they went past the 11 o'clock closing, and they were busy all night, and they just realized it was morning. Hey, that kind of worked. Maybe we should look at 24 hours. The other is a 7-Eleven that was purpose-built. It was 24 hours, and guess what? It was in Las Vegas. So go figure. So anyway, going back to August 1961. Rumor has it that one of those dozen retailers who was there at that to found NACS really was there to kind of showcase his business and ultimately say, look, I'm big enough that 7-Eleven should purchase me. So mergers and acquisition, been on the industry's mind for 62 years and counting. So they all get together in Kansas City. Couple days, they get to spend the first day, arrive, second day, kind of hammering out things. Third day, here's what we're going to do. And really, there were three questions. Number one, should we form an association? Number two, what's the name? And number three, what are the next steps? So the first step was easy. I think they immediately, nobody would have been there in Kansas City if they didn't think there was a reason to form an association. So they did. The next big thing was, what should the name be? The most popular name for our industry at the time was drive-in stores. And we were almost the National Association of Drive-In Stores. There also was the opinion that that really felt like Dairy Queen or some of these ice cream places, that really wasn't who we are. Mini marts was a term. Bantam stores was a term. National Association of Bantam Stores wouldn't have played out well. But midget mart was another term that was often used to describe our stores. And it's a really good idea that wasn't our name. John Roscoe, actually, I'd mentioned him earlier. He was the one who really forced the name convenience stores. And in fact, a couple years earlier, he was really the first one that used the name convenience store in print that we found. It was an article in Grocery Headquarters or a publication like that in the mid-'50s. And that was the first time we really saw the name convenience store. But by 1961, it was around enough where he was able to lobby and effectively get our name to be the National Association of Convenience Stores. So our association was born. And just for context, on August 14th, 1961, so was Cindy Brady. Of course, not the character from the Brady Bunch. Susan Olsen, who plays Cindy Brady, was born and tied into the industry. I don't know if you remember that Brady Bunch episode where they went to the Grand Canyon and they asked for directions at that gas station, and it didn't necessarily go according to plan, but it really, let's not blame the convenience store for that one. So the third step in looking at the formation of NACS is, what's the next step? And if you come to NACS, there's 3 pages that kind of outlines what happened that day. And it was basically, here's the people who are there. Let's agree to meet again, and then let's agree to meet again. And of course, with that, they basically scheduled, let's have dinner, let's have drinks, and let's talk this through. So they agreed to meet in December 1961, and really that was the first NACS, call it the NACS show. It wasn't quite called the NACS show then. It was called the NACS annual meeting. And that was held in Dallas. And the event in Dallas, the mayor of Dallas actually was at that first meeting, and his name was Earl Cabell, and his family ran convenience stores, so there was a vested interest for him to be there. Now, for anybody that remembers that Oliver Stone movie JFK, which was kind of a conspiracy movie, pretty much everybody at some point was accused of being in on the assassination of JFK, and of course, the movie, he was another one there, but it was an interesting conspiracy movie. So they also decided at that first annual meeting that they needed an executive director, and his name was Harry Hunter. He came from a background of grocery. He was in San Diego. Now, those familiar with the Hunter Club, which is an elevated, engaged class of supplier member, the Hunter Club is named after Harry Hunter. And the logo is a fox because his nickname was a silver fox. And so that's why you see the logo of a fox on Hunter Club materials. So he was in San Diego. Our first office was in San Diego. But a year or two later, we realized that really our future, in addition to having meetings and getting together and networking, sharing ideas, it was really important to have our voice heard. So we moved our office to Washington, D.C. In that first office, Harry was extremely proud that he found an affordable place downtown and brought a couple NACS members there. And they saw the room number, and the room number was 711. And they said, Harry, there's a bunch of us as members. We can't possibly have our address as 711. They did, but a couple years later, they moved to outside into the suburbs and moved to Falls Church, Virginia, ultimately moved to Alexandria, Virginia, where we are now. So looking at some of those early meetings, a couple stand out. Every year, attendance almost doubled from 1961, keep on going. 1964, John Roscoe, I mentioned, innovator within our industry, he helped bring forward a new technology that allowed for self-serve fuel. And he was on a panel at the 1964 annual meeting with a butcher talking about new profit centers. And John said that they both talked about here's different things to do. And then they had the Q&A period, like is typical in a lot of education sessions. Every question was to the butcher. They all want to know how to sell meat in the store. Nobody really had an interest, at least in this education session, that gas was going to be our future. And of course, today, 80% of the gas sold in the country is sold at convenience stores. Started slowly there. It ultimately grew through the changing of some self-serve regulations. Now there's only one state that mandates full-serve gas, and that is New Jersey. But it's a combination of changing those laws and also the couple price pressures in the early 70s with the oil embargo, the OPEC oil embargo of the 72, 73 led to price spikes, and also later on in the decade, 1979, when we first hit $1 gas. Then you saw people really move to self-serve, saved them a couple cents a gallon. Another interesting NACS show was the following year. It's in Washington, D.C. We're now headquartered in the district, and we had our show there. And Anita Bryant, who was a renowned singer at the time, was the entertainer, or actually I should say, was supposed to be the entertainer. And when it came time for her to perform, she was a no-show. Apparently, Lyndon B. Johnson, president, said, hey, she's in town. I'd love her to perform at the White House. And that's what she did instead of appearing at the NACS annual meeting. And anybody who was at that meeting got a personal apology note from Anita explaining why she was at the White House that night when she was slated to be at the NACS annual meeting. Speaking of presidents, there have been a couple NACS presidents who have been at NACS annual meetings or NACS shows. First was Ronald Reagan. He was at the NACS annual meeting in the late 1970s. It was between the time when he was governor of California and when he was running for president. We've also had Bill Clinton at the NACS show, and we've had George W. Bush. And his dad, George H.W. Bush, was also at a NACS event in conjunction with FMI. So we've had a couple presidents at the NACS show. As the industry moved along in the 60s, it really focused, NACS and the industry focused on education, and specifically, how do you take education beyond the traditional grocery and customize it to what convenience stores need, which was very different. One of the first things they did was video projectors, and they created videos. They created videos and would even sell the projectors to retailers. Here's how you do training programs and get it all straight. Very much a focus on how do you share ideas. And right around 1970, they had the first chart of accounts that led to the state of the industry and really bringing together everything in a centralized place. Now, that first SOI in 1970, State of the Industry, showed annual sales of about $1 billion. Today, sales 900 times that, about $906 billion to be exact. So we go into the 70s and have annual meetings. And in 1973, 50 years ago, the suggestion was, let's also have an expo. They had cabanas. And it was the first attempt at that, just really poolside kind of things. The idea was show exhibitors we are viable for an expo. And 3 years later, 1976, we had a more traditional expo. That was really the first expo that looked like an expo, even though it was still largely small booths and not many of them in comparison to the NACS show that you see today. So every 2 or 3 years, we'd have an expo. And originally it was every 3 years, and it tightened every 2 years. We finally had what you would call the NACS show, and it was called the NACS show in 1993, and then it was repeated in 1994. So that's really the first time that we had a NACS show that went year after year after year. And in the ensuing years, so actually since 1961, we've had an annual meeting or a NACS show every year except for one, where we went digital. Now, we almost didn't have a NACS show in the year 2005. Our show was slated to be in New Orleans, and a month before the trade show, Hurricane Katrina hit. Gas prices hit $3 a gallon, all kinds of concerns about that, but even bigger concerns about how will we possibly hold a trade show in New Orleans. And simply asked three questions. Can we keep the show in New Orleans? Quickly found out the answer is no. Can we move the show? And the answer is maybe. And a third question is, if we move the show, can we make it a world-class show? Those are the three questions. People got together, talked about, what can we do and all that. Turned out we were able to find Las Vegas as a replacement. Every flight was changed. Every hotel room booked thus far was changed. The expo was relayed out to a different convention, and we had the NACS show the week before Thanksgiving, and we still got 22,000 people there, which is 10 weeks planning for a show that normally takes a year planning. I'm glad we've never had to do that again. But the only time that we really didn't have a NACS show was the year 2020. And of course, that was the teeth of the pandemic where people really weren't able to get together on any level. And that year, we went digital, and we had something called Crack the Code, where we replicated as best as we could the virtual experience that included networking, learning, and finding out new products and ideas. Now, for what we were facing at the time, it worked as best as we could. But we all, I think, agree that being together at the NACS show is the best way to learn about the industry, to find new ideas, and to move our industry forward. So we spent about 24 minutes talking about the history of NACS. So where are we going? And what's going to happen next? I guess one thing you could do, go to the NACS show. In the open-ended comments that we hear from members, the number one thing they say is, we are here to see the future. We are here to see new ideas. We're here to learn from each other. So whether it's a NACS show, whether it's some other industry event, the key thing is, as we move forward, how do we continue to share ideas? How do we continue to network? How do we continue to find things that work for our industry better than anybody else? Because let's face it, everyone sells convenience today. What we do is we sell it better than anybody else. We also have a lot of advocacy issues, and it's a chance to get together and talk about how do we make our voice heard. We have issues like the Credit Card Competition Act that we're trying to move forward in Congress. We have all kinds of other issues that we're facing on advocacy. And one of the things that we say in government relations is, if you don't have a seat at the table, that means if you are not engaged, if you're not talking to your elected leaders, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu. So let's continue to have a seat at the table. Let's continue to get together, and let's continue to expand this amazing industry that started with the formation of NACS 62 years ago. Take you through history every now and then and look at how did we come to be, to look at where we're going. And that's just a 25-minute summary of the last 62 years, with maybe a little diving back before that even. So hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have suggestions for other things we can talk about, whether it's other moments in the history of NACS or the history of the industry or the future, we'll probably bring them to you on Convenience Matters. Thanks for listening.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in partnership with Human Factor. For more information, visit convenience.org.